I made some decent headway today on refining and deepening a water holding system in our neighbor's landscape. I talked about it in some previous videos, but I'm going to explain the project from the beginning briefly with some links to those videos and then what it is that's been upgraded. But we've now accumulated probably about 1,000 gallons of water in the last few hours into storage that will be useful for our high tunnel. This structure in peak summer, when we hit almost 90 degrees, a bunch of days in a row, full sun with no clouds, demands a lot of water. We haven't been actively watering a huge amount. Some of the plants can really show that. They seem a little dry and unhappy. Learning over time that committing more and more plants like figs and rosemary and hot peppers and plants that don't mind the dryness seems to be really helpful and useful. Things like lemongrass and ginger, they're really sad about how little water they've been getting. So we need more water for this space. We have this decently nice sized pond. It's a really lovely swimming pond, really nice ecosystem space. And we had a bunch of good rains that filled it nicely recently, but I'd rather not be dipping really hard into this. In the fall, winter, and spring, when this is filled to overflowing most of the time, it's a nice short commute to set up a solar panel, put a pump and water in here. But if we get a dry spell and we've sipped too much of the water out of the pond, I'd be pretty bummed to have hurt the ecosystem here. It's a good backup, but it's not something I want to use by default. Off the north side of our neighbor's garage upslope here, we have a whole bunch of IBC totes. I spoke about these in past videos. I'm going to link here if I can find a video that's relevant. And in this case, we started with 6. We just added a 7th one on here. They hold around 300 gallons a piece, so solidly 2,000 gallons worth of potential water storage and a nice big roof area. The last couple of rains, one of them was extremely violent and it washed right over the gutters. Another one flushed a bunch of stuff and it clogged the gutters. So we had a couple opportunities to collect a ton of rainwater that didn't come to fruition. But today I brought the water level up maybe a little bit shy of 1,000 gallons, 800 gallons or so, using a nice new contraption. That's what it looked like a few hours ago before we started the pump. And let me explain how this is working. A little further east of the garage is this impoundment that our neighbor dug with the backhoe on his tractor. I documented the experiment with this. I think it was 2 parts of two different videos, one introducing the topic and one showing the initial dig. And I'm going to link to them as this continues on. And the flash rains, even though we didn't collect them in the rainwater tanks, we had a physical interruption with the downspouts and then it overshot. So there was that, but the landscape itself took on all the rain. And this filled up really nicely and overflowed through this portal over here. And so there's all this excess water that is now available. And so I finally put together a little bit better of a prototype for a pump. You can see that silly little heavy whipping cream container. Just grabbed what was in the recycling, but that's the buoy. Let me bring this over. And what we've got here is a really simple thing. It's a bilge pump. This happens to be a 700 gallon per hour bilge pump. The intake is on that side. That's a piece of door screen and hay wire that's tied around it to make a little bit of a filter, and then the milk container is the buoy to keep it just below water surface, as you can see. And I can just push it right back out there. The string tied to it is tethered to that metal line just to kind of keep it centered if it draws the water down. And that simple little pump, $20, $30 little pump, attached to sections of scrap garden hose that runs over to the tanks, which we'll look at in a moment. It's wired directly to this one panel. This happens to be a 150 watt panel. And I've got these Anderson power poles. If you look that up on YouTube, you can find videos of how people wire these. And maybe I'll make this video at some point. Pretty straightforward. It's nice because it's an easy way to plug them on or turn them on and off. And these can get wet. You can rinse them off if they get muddy. So now the panel is attached to the pump. It is churning away, lifting that excess water from the hillside and running it through this length of hose up and over right into this tank. There we go. So as long as sun is on that panel for the most part, and the water level doesn't drop very much, it seems like it dropped about an inch or two from that pond, it should be able to keep itself centered in the pond, follow the water line so it's not dredging up super muddy stuff at the bottom, and just all day send water into this tank. Now this tank is set to equalize with a really simple split through all of these other tanks. 700 gallons per hour is what the pump is rated for, but with this kind of lift, it's probably more like 500 gallons an hour. So in about 3 or 4, let's say 4 or 5, well, heck, be real generous and say in 6 hours, it should be able to fill that tank and have it equalize amongst all these to the point of overflowing. So then we would have cached a little bit over 2,000 gallons of water in containers that are perched high enough in the landscape to use gravity to then feed down to that high tunnel. Certainly my preference is to have the more passive system happen, where the rainwater comes down, just is collected, they fill up, they equalize, sometimes overflow, and that'll work again now that I know to make sure the gutters are cleaned in between really intense rains, and just know that it's a loss. If it's an explosive rain, it overshoots it, and so be it. But having that hole over there with the impoundment really makes it as like a backup plan that we can still grab that water while it's charged in the landscape and slowly flowing through. So rather than grabbing the water out of this pond, which we've come to really borderline need, I almost need to go in there every day. It's my source of shower. I kind of wash my clothes in there while I'm swimming with the pond water. Anyway, instead of using that, there's tadpoles and everybody in there. We can now use this line that's run from the barn where all those tanks are down to this 4-way splitter. And so all of this is connected to that series of tanks. And this hose goes to a black hose that's in the high tunnel so we can hand water. This hose goes over to a stock tank that is used for a compost tea that has a little float valve. And this hose goes down to a series of tanks that are in our garden, each with a float valve to keep them filled but not overflowing. So there's a lot of aspects of our system that depend on those tanks. It's a really nice, convenient way to fill them. You just turn that on, and water that was otherwise running through a ditch on its way down to the road could be lifted by the energy of the sun directly into a DC panel, into some containers, and then gravity can bring it down to here. It's not an explosive rate of flow, but we're also just using standard garden hose size. But it's certainly a way to walk around and provide good, deep applications of water where the plants need it. So we'll soak the heck out of these gingers and tomatoes, the peppers, really, really deeply soak them, and try to follow up with some deep layers of mulch so that any of the drying forces in here are minimized. But that water system should be able to let us coast through this heat wave. Once we get caught up on rehydrating things, I'd like to go through and finish planting out. Like there's some gaps in here where we pulled some lettuces. This sort of bare soil is just punishing for the overall health of this space. So we'll either get down some mulch, or better yet, push in some seeds for things like cucumber or okra or some other hot weather loving crop. Maybe do a little bit of hand work while the water's flowing in to establish better swales and water equalization through here, so we can let the hose just sit in some spots and equalize watering. Just theoretically drop it right here and have it water right down the line if I had things shaped correctly. But you can see where it's bare soil, it looks rough. You're gonna need a fair bit of water to get over that hurdle, but we're getting it now. And then where it's mulched, the plants are doing really nicely. So we'll harvest and store the water, capture that energy up high in the landscape, and then focus on deep hydration, deep mulch, and a continual filling of this space with plants. We'll share more notes as it evolves.